So welcome everyone. My name's Danny Wain and I'm the FinPro executive, and I've got the pleasure of being your host today. But first of all, I'd like to do the acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people, and recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend this to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So welcome everyone to our webinar, the LG Act Amendment Act 2022, in particular what the changes will be and what they'll do. Now, I'd like to welcome, and I'll do a bit of a brief bio. We've got Dr. Leighton Vivian from DJPR. Leighton's the senior manager at DJPR, Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, and has led the finance and performance team at Lockyer Victoria since 2016. He oversees a portfolio that includes the finance and reporting requirements, Know Your Council program, and the rating reform program. He managed the Secretariat for the 2019-20 Local Government Rating Review System Review. He's previously worked in project management and development assistance in the Asia Pacific region, in independent consulting and governance, taxation and electoral systems, and taught international relations at La Trobe University when he completed a PhD in 2008. We might just let you know, if you've got any questions, we'll try and Leighton will try and answer those as we go, or if not, we'll get to them at the end of the presentation, but we'll have a look at those as we go. We'll try and keep an eye on those. So over to you, Leighton.
Thank you, Danny, and thanks for everyone for coming along today. It's an enormous crowd. It's quite flattering. I'll throw up a slideshow that'll just take us through today's session. And as Danny mentioned, if you've got questions, please throw them in the chat as we go. I think that makes for a lot more of an engaging session if we can just break it up with some queries, and those questions often take us off in different tangents. So thanks again for having me along today, and we'll talk today about the Local Government Legislation Amendment Rating and Other Matters Act 2022. That's quite a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it the Act from now on. This, as you know, was the Act that was passed in August. So I'm just having some problems on the screen. There we go. And achieved royal assent then. Now, it's important, I think, there's a little bit of background there as to the timelines. This was one of the last pieces of legislation the government introduced, and we were able, fortunately, with some work, to squeeze it through. It was considered the first part of what is likely to be two parts of legislation surrounding the rating reforms that followed on from the Local Government Rating System Review from 2020. Now, importantly, and it's something quite, I think, critical to point out here, is that there's quite a few other matters in this bill or this act. I'm not going to discuss those today. They're largely technical, or they relate to freedom of information matters. If anyone does have any queries about that, I can refer those. I'll take them on notice. But I will be talking today, however, just on part 2 of the Act, which is the rating elements. And these elements are actually intended, they come into force not until 20th of June next year, unless they are proclaimed by the Minister at an earlier time. It is intended that we will be seeking to proclaim that earlier. This is not going to happen before the election, but it is our intention to have that proclamation, which is essentially an exercise by which the Minister brings these parts into force, particularly to ensure that any ministerial guidelines and the setting of new interest rates or penalty interest happens well in advance of the financial year. We'd obviously like to get that done sooner rather than later to ensure there's plenty of lead time for you guys to make any required changes, if any. So it is the intention to proclaim that earlier than 20th of June 2023. And we're aiming, I can't sort of make promises because it's out of our control a bit, but probably either towards the end of this calendar year or early next calendar year, would be seeking to proclaim that. If that occurs, of course, there'll be plenty of communications around what that means and any impact it'll have on you guys. So they're the basic timelines. I'll now move into just giving a brief overview of the basis for this legislation, and then we'll turn to the specific elements of the reforms. So this was the first, what is anticipated to be one of two pieces of legislation that follow or implement the government-supported recommendations of the rating system review that took place in 2019-20. When that report was completed was March 2020. The government released its response to the 56 recommendations in December 2020. And so we're in a position then, we had 36 out of the 56 recommendations that the government was supportive of, and beginning to develop an implementation plan for those. For those of you who are familiar with that report, the 56 recommendations were covered an enormous breadth. It was a full-scale review into the rating system, and the recommendations covered everything from quite significant, indeed radical reforms, to things like rating exemptions and alternative rating arrangements, all the way through to small and minor changes through to administrative reforms, governance, and the like. A lot of the recommendations as well would require, and still do require, a lot of further work as well, which is why the reforms were then split up into two phases. So these more straightforward reforms, the ones that required legislative change and could be converted into legislative change without the need for further work, were planned to form part of the first phase of reforms. It was then in May, of course, that the Ombudsman published their investigation into how local councils respond to ratepayers in financial hardship report. Now, this report, as you know, of course, looked at just one narrow area of the rating system, in particularly how councils were responding in the context of COVID. The Ombudsman's recommendations had quite a lot of crossover with those made by the rating system review. However, there were some other areas that needed further work. And I suppose one of the critical areas that we had to further develop were to ensure that the reforms that the Ombudsman was recommending didn't necessarily jeopardize other elements of the rating system, and didn't jeopardize more broadly the retention of council autonomy as the third tier of government to essentially raise its own revenue via its own taxation system. Specifically, that included dealing with recommendations the Ombudsman made to define terms like financial hardship in legislation, and that's something that has not been pursued, and it's something that we worked with the government to develop an approach which would ensure that the legislative arrangements remained fairly open, that councils retained autonomy, and that concepts like financial hardship would largely remain one in which discretionary or contemporary practices inform how that's understood rather than a legislative definition. I suppose in practice, the best way to describe that would be chip in statute 10 years ago. It's very unlikely that concepts like family violence would have been included in that. Therefore, if you were to define it in the Act, you would end up with a very narrow term, and one in which councils would be actually constrained for dealing with the many and all sorts of possible scenarios that arrive. So walking some of those things back and developing a package of reforms that made sense, what was an important part of this work. So I'll move now to the actual reforms themselves, and we'll go through a bit of a summary of the changes, and then we'll go into a little bit more depth about what some of these actually mean in practice. The government was keen to ensure that the centrepiece of these reforms centred around financial hardship, in particular the payments of rates and charges for those either experiencing or facing financial hardship or payment difficulty. As you know, that the current legislation, or I should say the 89 Act, was fairly limited in terms of what constituted that. Financial hardship is just a concept that remains as a common term in the Act and is not defined. And it leaves it up to councils to determine how they really wish to handle that. The first starting point for us in developing some reforms, and ensuring that we aligned both the recommendations of the rating review and the Ombudsman's report together was to actually formalise payment plans as an alternative way for ratepayers to pay their outstanding rates and charges. Now, we know, of course, for many years, councils have offered payment plans as an alternative to the 4 instalments. However, the problem has been that payment plans have remained an informal arrangement between a council and a ratepayer. That's great, and it's also led to a lot of councils doing some pretty smart things, but it's also led to sometimes a little bit of confusion and some uncertainty about the status of those. By formalising payment plans in the legislation, it now ensures that those payment plans, as they are developed between a council and a ratepayer, will have a formal status and therefore will be a lot more stable ground by which those arrangements can be made and continue. The other key areas that have been changed are that the Minister will now be setting the penalty interest rate that may be levied on unpaid rates and charges. For many years, that has been set by the Attorney General via the Penalty Rate Interest Rates Act 1983. This legislation largely relates to penalty interest rates for outstanding warrants. And since 2015, it has been set at 10%. The government took a view that they thought 10% was disproportionate, and therefore a decision has been made and now reflected in the Act that the Minister for Local Government will now be setting the interest rate that may be levied. The Minister is required in using that power to consult with the Essential Services Commission in setting that, and the Essential Services Commission has got a range of things it must consider. These aren't straightforward for them. They don't just have to consider levels of interest that might seem reasonable for someone facing financial hardship. They also have to consider the requirement or the importance of having a penalty interest rate that actually acts as a disincentive for non-payment. So the ESC is required to balance out all of those considerations and to provide that advice to the Minister, who will then set the amount themselves. The third aspect on this page to point to is that the Act will now limit the use or put some restrictions on the use of court orders. At the moment, councils may use a court order to sue for debt, any outstanding debt. The changes here still provide for that. However, they will mean that rates or charges have to have been outstanding for more than 2 years, or 24 months. The intent here was to ensure that there's what the government believed was to be an appropriate escalation process. The use of a court order can be, as it is currently, applied, and the government considered the costs of a court order, because they can be placed upon the property, could be used in a disproportionate fashion. For example, for $3,000 worth of unpaid rates, the costs of a court order, which are around the $1,400 to $1,600 mark, them being added to the charge was considered disproportionate if they're being used in shortly after the rates are either have been unpaid or there's only small amounts outstanding. So this Act will now place a restriction on the use of court order. After that 2-year period, if rates and charges have not been paid and a payment plan has not been maintained by the ratepayer, councils will still be free to use a court order and sue for the debt in the Magistrates Court. That Magistrates Court order is, of course, still also required if councils move to sale of the property and that is going to will remain as 3 years of outstanding payments. So these are the 3 main elements that have changed the arrangements. The fourth aspect, which is described at the top of that slide, is that the Act will now provide the Minister the power to issue guidance regarding these things, and that guidance will cover the payment of rates and charges, said the definition or the meaning of financial hardship, noting here that the ministerial guidance will contain information on what constitutes financial hardship, but the primary legislation will not. Okay, so it will allow that guidance to be much broader and therefore be updated in changes over time along with contemporary standards. So it is going to provide for a much broader, it will point to a range of circumstances that could constitute financial hardship. The guidelines will also be able to cover off on the application by councils of financial hardship policies and processes of how councils should offer those to ratepayers, including how ratepayers must also apply for them. And the guidance will also be able to include direction on how council should waive any interest on unpaid rates and charges. Remember that the minister will be setting the interest rate that may be levied on unpaid rates and charges. That will still be, as it is now, the maximum amount. The ministerial guidance will provide direction on whether any of that should be lowered or any amount waived for certain circumstances. Of course, many councils already do waive portions or all of those amounts for circumstances of financial hardship. And I think it's important to point out here that a lot of these practices have already been ones in which majority of councils, if not most, are all doing anyway now. So in a lot of respects, this will be formalising a lot of those practices, most of all payment plans, which almost all councils have been offering to their ratepayers for many years now. They're the elements of financial hardship. I'm not sure if there's a few questions in the chat. I'll just check. So I've got a limited number of screens.
There's a couple of comments there, but one was about hardship, and John Brockway was suggesting that FinPro get involved with working on a definition of the hardship too. Leighton, that work's happening with the ESC too, isn't it? They're doing some work in that space in the hard.
They have, yes. Thanks, Danny, and thanks for the question, John. Yes, they have. Look, the ESC's work previously on water and energy sectors will inform this. It will inform the ESC's advice that they provide around this. Something that we're also, and the government has been clear about as well, is that there's a key distinction here. Look, the ESC have dealt with, or they provide a lot of policy and obviously provide a lot of definitional work and guidance with regards to the water and energy sector. Rates, however, are not an essential service. And I think it's an important distinction to make, and it's one in which the government has also made, is that financial hardship in the context of an essential service is a bit different from that of the payment of rates. Rates are a tax on a property. Property ownership is not an essential service. And it's an important distinction to make, isn't it? Everybody needs water and energy, but not everybody needs to own a property and pay rates. And ultimately, there's a point in which if you can't pay rates, you have to sell your property, and that's something which I think is an uncomfortable reality for some. So in developing that ministerial guidance with the ESC, we'll also be taking our advice also from the likes of the SRO and looking to the ATO practices as well, to ensure that the advice that comes out is actually appropriate for what is the levying of a legitimate tax, as opposed to fees and charges for essential services. The purpose of these guidelines is to ensure that there is a consistent definition to an extent. But I think in answer to your question, John, it's also essential and fundamental that the application of any definition of financial hardship also comes with discretion on the part of the council, because every single circumstance is different. And every ratepayer who comes to your council saying, I'm unable to pay my rates because of financial hardship, has a different story. And that's why the element of discretion is so important, because as I said before, if we had baked in a definition into primary legislation 10 years ago, we probably wouldn't include some things that we consider central to our understanding of financial hardship now. So that discretionary element's really essential to retain, because without it, there's a greater risk that actually people who are in genuine financial hardship would actually be excluded from that understanding. So that's why any description of what constitutes financial hardship are now going to be sitting in ministerial guidance, not the primary legislation. I hope that makes sense and answers the question.
Leighton, I've got a question just on the interest. A number of councils that have got, a lot of councils have got very good hardship policies already, and they'll need to adjust those obviously when the guidelines come out. Do you think that where councils are currently setting their own interest rate on hardship cases, some I know at Monash, we've got a 0 and a 2% rate for hardship cases, approved hardship cases, 0 for pensioners. Will we still be allowed to do that, something lower than what the ministerial rate will be?
I think it would be a strong expectation, and look, I suppose I'm speaking a little bit hypothetically here, Danny, but it would be an expectation that councils both retain the discretion, but also do reduce penalty interest on unpaid rates and charges for ratepayers experiencing financial hardship once a payment plan is established.
Yep.
It's important to have that discretion, and that's why these requirements will be sitting in ministerial guidance. We can go into a bit more depth, but I suppose it's just important to point out here that any ministerial guidance is going to, by its very nature, be largely process in its orientation. It's going to be making reference to, has a council considered this? Has a council made, an offer of a payment plan available to the ratepayer? Those sorts of things. The ministerial guidance as a legislative instrument can't be prescribing very specific outcomes, and nor should they. Ultimately, the best determinants of what should be in a payment plan for a ratepayer are the ratepayer and the council themselves, in order to fit the very individual and specific circumstances. And for many of you on this call, and for many of the revenue managers and their staff, every circumstance is different. And by putting this in guidance, it will give broad direction and set expectations, but ultimately the specifics of any agreement in a payment plan will be tailored to fit the circumstances as they fit. And yes, reducing any penalty interest may well be a part of that, including all the way down to 0, if the council so desires. So I'll just now move to the next slide. Sorry, I've just lost my call here. Sorry, guys. I've had some IT problems here. So I'm just going to have to stop sharing the screen, guys. Beg your pardon for a moment. I've lost everything. Danny, are you able to confirm if that's coming up now?
Yeah, it's come up, Leighton, and it's still on that same slide on the.
Okay. On the front, no, it's not.
No, it's on the payment of rates and charges one, the setting the interest rate slide.
Okay. Now, can you? I'm really sorry, folks. We're having a bad day at our end. It's all right, I'm going to have to stop sharing again. Try that one more time. And that should be working now.
Yes, it's come up on the double screen view with the next slide, but that's probably okay, I think, for most people.
All right, sorry, folks. I think that's. Let me just.
So we're still on slide 4.
Now, has that moved?
Flipped over now, yep.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so the next slide is a bit more detail around the maximum interest rate on unpaid rates and charges. I'll just briefly go through these as the sort of the policy rationale for this. This was driven in particularly by the Ombudsman's report, but it was also identified by the Local Government Rating System Review, and particularly an inconsistency across the sector that, whilst an inconsistency is actually the default position, as in 10% was always the maximum a council could charge. However, councils retained full discretion to reduce that. However, what was recognised and found by the rating system review and also by the Ombudsman's inquiry was that a lot of councils weren't reducing that 10% at all. They actually weren't applying any discretion. This was, I suppose, something that the rating system review was critical of, and certainly the Ombudsman was quite critical of, that councils weren't applying reasonable discretion in this area. And this was a bit of a reason why the government then took the view that 10% was disproportionate and that the minister would now set that amount. So as I mentioned before, the ESC will be provided or required to give advice to the minister, and the Essential Services Commission is required to balance out a range of considerations in providing that advice. Importantly here, one of those considerations is that there must be a disincentive for non-payment. Now, 10% is sort of the ballpark for non-payment of rates and charges and other taxes. At the moment, for example, the SRO for the non-payment of land tax at the moment is set at 8% plus a floating amount of, and I think it works out about 8.25, I think at the moment. They also, of course, have discretion to raise that more. ATO or Commonwealth taxation is a little bit higher. So that importance of having that disincentive is there, and that's going to be one of the considerations of the ESC in providing an advice. So I think that's an important one for yourselves as FinPro members here to recognise that the ESC is not just going to be providing advice here to say that everybody should receive either zero interest or only a nominal amount. It actually needs to take into account that importance of having essentially a penalty for non-payment. This is one of the elements that actually one of the reasons why we'll be seeking to have this part of the Act proclaimed earlier, so we can actually ensure that this formal process commences sooner rather than later. And so any guidelines and the setting of the interest rates, setting of the interest rate by the minister comes out sooner rather than later for you guys. We'd really like to have this done quite early in the new year. And we recognise that for many councils, this may require some administrative changes internally. So we do want to ensure there's sufficient time in terms of several months to tool up for any changes that you might need. So it's why we'll be looking to proclaim earlier, so we can get this work underway with the Essential Services Commission and ensure that the minister sets that penalty interest rate sooner rather than later. Okay. I'll move now to, if there's any more questions, please sing out, but otherwise I might now move to the other parts of the Act. If there's any? No? Okay. I'll now move to the new...
There's one there just to come up from David Harrington. How does the interest on unpaid rates and charges relate to interest on unpaid fire service levy? The interest on the fire service levy is under its own Act.
And it will remain that way. And I realise that's something that administrative-wise is a bit of a confusion, because it's going to mean potentially several interest rates or different interest rates applying. But yes, it's the interest rate or any arrangements around the fire services property levy are unchanged. I'll now move to one of the reforms, which is actually, I think, quite an exciting one, and I'll explain the background for this one just after a sip of water. So for those who were keen readers of the Rating System Review final report will know that there were some significant recommendations made around reforming the exemptions framework. The exemptions framework was not, however, none of these changes were supported by the government. In particular, the recommendations for change made by the review centred around replacing the existing exemptions for a new public benefit test. The review also recommended that that same public benefit test also be provided to councils to use for their own council rebates and concessions. Now, that was a reform that the government did support. And as you know now, that the criteria in the legislation for rate rebates or concessions are limited to essentially the preservation of buildings and the protection of the environment. What this new public benefit criteria, though, will afford is a new test that will really allow a council, if it so desires, to offer rate rebates and concessions for broad public benefit use. And that public benefit use also has a couple of sub-criteria that the land use must be for the public benefit, which includes being free of charge or nominal charge to the public, and not for the use of distribution of profit. So the concept of public benefit was discussed at depth in the rating system review final report. It was deemed to be a much more contemporary understanding, and the concept of public benefit has been used quite increasingly around the world, particularly in common law countries, as a concept to apply for tax concessions and exemptions. It's deemed to have a much more contemporary understanding and therefore a bit broader, beyond the more traditional understanding of charity, which has the understanding of charity, certainly the legislative understanding, goes all the way back to the 1890s through a UK court case, and that precedent has dictated the understanding of charitable use ever since. So public benefit now is a new criteria in the legislation. Councils will be able to, of course, do this. They're not required to. It will sit in the rate rebate and concession as simply a new criteria alongside the preservation of buildings and the environment now. Because this is new, we don't quite know yet exactly what it's going to get used for. Now, we've got some ideas. At the bottom of that slide, it does make reference to their community gardens or public art spaces on private land. Could be some of the uses that could be eligible. But there's all sorts of uses that could apply in the future. This new definition or new criteria could be used in all sorts of creative ways by councils. And we'd really want to encourage councils to think creatively, if they wish to offer their own rebates and concessions, how they might use it to encourage certain types of public benefit use in their own community. So we don't think this is going to be used right away by a lot of councils, but it is there now as an option. And it's an option that we anticipate some councils will pick up over time, and in the years to come, there could be all sorts of creative ways that could be applied or not applied as a council so desires. There's not going to be any requirement by the state government for councils to use this. It's in the legislation now, and it's up to councils to choose how they use this instrument, if at all. So it's over to you guys, I suppose, in the years to come as to how councils may choose to apply this in accordance with the legislation as it now stands. Were there any more questions on this one? Sorry,
yeah, we have got
Wei
one
had a
there
question
from Wei Chen. Does this reduce our revenue, or is it just changing the distribution amongst residences?
Yes, it will. It doesn't actually reduce your revenue, Wei. It will be a cost. Rebates and concessions now are actually a cost item of a council. So it's actually a cost to a council if a council chooses to offer any rate, rebate or concession. A rebate or a concession comes after a property has been rated. It is an amount of money rebated or returned to the ratepayer or group of ratepayers. So it's actually a cost item on your balance sheet, and therefore budgeted for.
Peter Lou's asking, do you see charitable exemptions being removed, e.g. schools?
Peter, I can't predict the future. I wish we could. The government was clear in its response to the rating system review that it would not be making any changes to the exemptions arrangements. I'm going to be a good bureaucrat, and so that's what the government's view was at the time. However, look, it could change in the future, but at the moment there are actually no plans to change any exemptions, including to private schools and state schools, which are exempt under a different arrangement. But no changes. There's no more questions on that one. I'll now move to the next slide, if it will let me. Right. Service charges. So this part of the legislation was recommended to be subject to something of a tidy up by the rating system review. council service charges allow a council to set a fixed amount or variable amount for the purposes of the collection and disposal of refuse currently. And the rating system review believed that that definition was somewhat legacy and old-fashioned. Over the recent years, we also have seen some issues with how that definition is applied, and could the collection and disposal of refuse, as stated in the legislation, accommodate things like the rehabilitation of legacy landfill sites? Could waste charges be levied for, say, public communication and campaigns about improving recycling practices and the like? So the change to that definition has been to now change from the collection and disposal of refuse to broadly waste management services. And the definition is aligned with the Circular Economy Act 2021, which contains many of the current government's recycling reforms. That new definition then should give much greater clarity that the sorts of waste management practices that councils now undertake may all be captured, and therefore service charges or waste charges that almost all councils now levy on properties can be set to accommodate all the activities that relate to waste management. So it's a much more contemporary definition, and it should give, I think, some much greater clarity to councils if there was some doubts about certain activities being included in that waste charge and the waste charge setting.
Leighton, a question just on that. Does that include legacy landfill issues? We're repeatedly seeing, EPA requests to upgrade and rehabilitate old tip sites. Will that be included in that, our ability to sort of recover some funds via those charges?
It is. Now, this doesn't absolve, obviously, a council from being transparent about that. I think that's an important part. There is no, of course, requirement that a waste charge must be cost recovery, but it is an expectation that that's largely that the charge that is set will align with the costs of councils. But yes, Danny, it is expected that that legacy landfill rehabilitation and other more broader waste management activities now, the costs of those it'll be possible to cover those with the waste charge. Now, the setting of that is still up to councils. If councils wish to subsidise some of their waste management activities through general rates or other sources of revenue, that's entirely up to them. But the new definition will indeed, yes, in answer to your question, it will allow some of those activities to be captured now, which previously, under the old legacy definition, arguably it was not possible. The two other little tweaks to the service charges, which ones I said was a bit of a tidy up, were to remove the service charge provisions for water and sewage. No council has offered those services for some time now, and so they are now being removed as a grounds to levy service charges. For some councils, and I believe there may be still some around that still do, for example, provide septic tank services, and others, councils are able to offer those on a fee-for-service basis if they so choose. It's just that they won't be able to levy them on a property via a service charge anymore. So that was, again, part of this legislative tidy up that was required.
Leighton, a question from Chen. Can waste charges be used to cover capital expenditure, i.e. buying 10,000 new bins?
I would assume that they're bins. If they're, yes, bins would be, yes, I imagine so. If they're bins for properties, yes.
And Peter Liu, I think, is in response to those added, suggest to recover the depreciation for smoothing out the charge, spreading the cost over years.
Yeah, Peter, I agree that would probably just be good financial practice in terms of setting the charge. I think the expectation here is that simply councils are transparent about how they're doing it, and it would probably be good practice, or it would be, I imagine, to look at smoothing out some of those costs over time, particularly for one-off pieces of capital investment. It would make sense to then smooth out the costs over time. Might result in fewer letters of complaint from ratepayers, I imagine. But I think the key point here is that councils are clear and transparent about what that waste waste service charge is actually including, both internally and also externally to your community. If there's no other questions on that one, I will now move to the 8th slide, and this is around a small change that was made to special rates and charges schemes. The driver for this reform was a clear recommendation of the rating system review, and it can be best summarised as a use it or lose it provision. It wasn't an issue that cropped up too many times, but it was found that there were some instances by which councils had special rates and charges schemes in place in that they had been declared, but the councils in question had not actually started the works that the scheme was related to, and therefore those schemes remained as an overlay on the property, but the works that they were related to had never actually commenced, and nor therefore had the levying. And what it meant over time was a problem that the scheme itself became opaque as properties were transacted, they were bought and sold. This scheme obviously remained on the property, but the new owner wasn't necessarily aware of it. The rating system review also took the view that if a council was going to declare a special rates and charges scheme, they should then be prepared to immediately get on with commencing the works. So the recommendation was that if a council's not actually started levying affected ratepayers within 12 months of declaring such a scheme, that the scheme itself will lapse. So it provides some incentive here for councils to get on with any works that are related. And so the change to the legislation now means that if the levying has not commenced, and obviously a council's not going to levy any ratepayers if the works haven't started, so if that levying has not commenced within 12 months of the declaration, the scheme will lapse, and that will then require councils to obviously go through the process of a special rates and charges, the declaration again, if they haven't actually commenced. So it will provide a little bit of incentive for councils to commence this. As I said, this wasn't a problem that the review found had occurred too often, but it is a small change just to provide that sort of hurry up. I'm also aware that there's not many councils who I imagine would be putting in place a scheme and they're not doing anything about it. So it's really a minor matter, and it was one that which was just seen as it's just a tidy up aspect, which probably won't affect too many councils. Just pause there if there's any particular questions on that one. If not, we'll move on. So that really is the end of the reforms. As I mentioned at the start, this Act did not contain sort of huge changes, but I will here just give a quick rundown of what's anticipated in the next phase. So, as I said at the start, the reforms to the rating system have been split up into 2 phases. The first one centered around the Act that we've just discussed. The second phase, which we'll be working on over the next 2 years, includes some of the non-legislative reforms and the reforms that were less developed in the review and ones that require further work. So these include the consideration of a valuation averaging mechanism, consideration of rating by title, or moving away from rating by occupancy to rating by title, which would align it with state land tax. Some other administrative reforms, which would include things like fully digitising the notice of acquisition process, which is a fairly frustrating experience for many councils at the moment. And also work on a new edition of the Best Practice Revenue and Rating Guide, which I'm pleased to say is in the final stages. There is, some of you are on this call, a working group comprising ourselves, the MAV, FinPro and the RMA, and we are working our way through the new 3rd edition of that guide. And we would hope to be launching that in the next few months. It's in the final draft now. So they're the longer term reforms that we'll be looking at. Again, a lot of them are sort of administrative and governance in nature, but we'd be keen to work with, obviously we will be working with yourselves and the sector quite closely in developing some of those further. because particularly they offer the opportunity to extract a lot of efficiencies and a lot of improvements in how we administer the rating system overall, particularly things like fully digitising then at the notice of acquisition process, which could also incentivise some other longer term software and administrative reforms, which hopefully could make your lives a lot easier in the future. I've just got a question here, Danny. Sorry, did you want to take that on?
Yeah, it's a bit of a comment too from Carolyn Ross.
Yep.
R.E. David's earlier post on FSPL interest being set on the FSPL Act. We are concerned that our rating system configuration will not allow for two interest rates, i.e. penalty interest rate act rate on FSPL and whatever rate is determined by the Minister for Unpaid Rates. Software changes may be required by a vendor and this may take some time.
Yes, I'm aware that this could be some issues here. I am aware that Pathway, which is used by a lot of councils, can accommodate multiple interest rates, but I know not all councils do. So I think that's something that would be good to, if there are some issues, obviously you have to work with your vendor, but it'd be good to convey that through FinPro as well. So if there's anything we're able to support you on, let us know if that presents a problem. But yes, it is likely to be a requirement that there will be multiple interest rates included in your system.
Leighton, in this, with regards to the 36 of the 56, that leaves 18 of the adding recommendations that weren't supported by the government. In a lot of those cases, they were quoting the difficulty with COVID, and they didn't want to. They thought they were probably. I thought they they're probably a bit radical at a time when there's a lot of constraints with regards to COVID and a lot of pressures on people. So are they permanently off the table? Some of those, the ones that weren't recommended.
Well, everything's permanent until it's not, Danny, I suppose is my roundabout way of answering that. The future could hold something. I think, and this is something I suppose is a challenging one, and it's one which, as and this is what I said when we spoke to the RMA a few weeks back, and there's a similar discussion we had. Local governments here have their own taxation system in the rating system. It's a really good system. It is, by most measures, very equitable. It's very fair. It's cheap and efficient to administer. It's also highly transparent. It's a very good taxation system, and you are custodians of it. It does then behove the local government sector to think about its rating system as a tax system and the responsibilities that come with that. And that includes, over time, advocacy or arguing that reforms need to be made to exemptions. And certainly the rating system review made a very strong case for those reforms to take place. That's something I think the local government sector has to consider, how it best makes that case, both to government of the day, but also it's to community. And I will just make one, I suppose, this is, I suppose, as an officer level, it's not the view of the government at all, is that local government needs to make its case here around reforms to this with an eye to the future and not just about the immediate revenue implications for itself. So a case around equity and longer term fairness of its own rating system. I hope that sort of answers the question in a roundabout way, Danny, but I think it's important here to make the point, you're stewards of a good taxation system, so make sure it's being used well and used wisely, and that will help over time, I think, ensure that the rating system gets further improved in terms of its overall equity and fairness.
Thanks, Leighton. Now, look, we'll open it up for just general questions now. And look, if you want, I'll put them in the chat box, or put your hand up and maybe just turn your microphone on before you start talking. It might be the best way to do it. Another one from Carolyn Ross. Can you tell us more about the consideration of rating by title and what that would mean?
Thanks, Carolyn. Well, we're just beginning to try and work that out ourselves. This was a recommendation of the review, and the recommendation itself didn't have a lot of detail, but it was really just about considering what would be the pros and cons or the benefits of such a change. Now, we have a situation at the moment where, of course, state land tax is, a property tax is levied via title, councils have, or local government rates have occupancy. There is both benefits of that. Obviously, divvying up things into occupancies has a lot of benefits, but it also does create some issues. This work really is about determining what are the pros and cons of that, of doing those things. But any of that work will also have to look at, well, if we came to a view collectively that rating by title was better, we'd also have to look closely at what is the pain involved at moving to that. And that's not a straightforward matter. It would be a significant administrative shift with costs, and any part of that work has to really closely consider whether those costs would make it worthwhile. There's obviously some implications of alignment between the two levels of government. There may be some benefits of that, but there's also some equity issues as well. There's a lot of reasons why rating by occupancy also is a lot better too. So that work is very undeveloped at this point, I'm afraid, Carol, and it's something that we're looking at probably having to set up as a separate project longer term, and one which would involve, I think, a lot of very close thought with the whole sector as to whether it would even be worthwhile. But we just don't know at this stage.
Now, Leighton, I've got a question regarding Cult Rec Land Act charges. It's a classic where there'll be 40 or 50 different best practice cases in Victoria, how councils deal with it. Very inconsistent, which creates a lot of angst, particularly for, I know, a lot of the large private golf courses in Metro Melbourne,
yes,
because they just can't see any consistency across the board. It keeps getting mentioned. It was raised. I know there were private golf clubs, particularly, put up submissions in the rating review panel. It keeps getting mentioned as part of briefs, but we don't seem to get much traction or much work coming out of that, or any sort of answers coming out. Do you know if there's anything? Is there anything in the offing in terms of some work in that space in terms of Cult Rec Land Act?
Thanks, Danny. I was waiting for someone to ask this question, but I will also say we'd also look to you guys, because Monash is one of the few councils that has a public policy on how it will actually rate cultural and rec land. It's a really difficult one, and obviously one which the review recommended reform on, which was not supported. We don't have a lot to go on to progress this other than in terms of good practice and getting some good practices pinned down. As I said, having some clarity in terms of policy by each council, I think, is a great start. Yourselves, and I think there's only a couple of other councils actually do that now, and so I think it would be a good step forward. It's something to make that a little bit more clear by each council's how they do it, because over time you'll get some alignment in practices.
Yep.
It's something also that the working group for the Better Practice, the new edition of the Better Practice Guide on Revenue and Rating, has looked at, and we are developing some content around that. So I think that will also help with some of that practice. I guess the uncertainty here is going to remain, unfortunately, until there's significant reform in that. We are stuck with an arrangement from the 1960s that lacks a lot of clarity. So it is going to, at some extent, remain up to individual councils to determine this. But we hope, guided by, I suppose, some consistent good practice. And I think a good starting point for any good practice is having some transparency about how councils will actually address that. There's no issues with councils using the valuation system or the property value as one of the pieces of information in determining the rates payable. There's obviously some other considerations which have to be thrashed out in each case. I'm sorry that doesn't really get us very far, unfortunately, because the government's lack of support for reform of that section of the Cultural and Recreational Land Act has left really largely the status quo in place. But I do think we can improve some things with some better transparency, and therefore that will support some more consistent practices by the sector.
No hands up, so I'm going to keep asking questions. I've got a whole range of them, Leighton, and this one's probably might be a bit out of left field, but back to the waste charges. There's only 6 or 7 councils now that don't have a full-on cost recovery program for waste charges. We're one of them, and But I know that a couple of councils have been considering introducing a waste charge, but not based on a fee cost per service per property, but basing it on a CIB rate.
Yes.
And I know there's one or two who have done that or trying to do it. There's no restrictions on that, is there, if we tried to do that?
There is not. The legislation allows a rate or a charge, and so that rate may be set against a property value. I know Banyule have done it this year for the first time. If anyone from Banyule's on this call, love to hear about your experience. I guess it just hasn't really been a common practice.
No.
It does make for, I think, cost recovery. It does make that sort of opaque. Now, whilst the legislation doesn't specify a need for cost recovery, I think it's not unreasonable to say that there should be transparency around what a charge is actually for, including a charge on a property and including the sense of rate. Now, obviously, general rates, council can explain what are the sort of services it provides. If it's a rate that's being levied for a specific tangible service, i.e. several bins and their collection, the general, I suppose, public or contemporary expectations around public transparency would tend to imply that a council should be able to explain and justify why the amount is. There's a nexus, I guess, between the amount levied and the cost of a specific service, which is why almost all councils have tended to use charges. So then, you know, if the charge is X amount, you can say, well, this is the costs of collection of the bin and transport to a depot and disposal. So I think how you skin the cat here can be done different ways, but irrespective of the path taken, the obligation should be on the council to be able to justify and explain to its community why it's set it as it's set.
Yeah. Peter Lewis made a comment on that one, inconsistent with the user pays principle for variable waste charge. I think Peter's from Banyule.
Yeah, look, as the legislation allows a council to do this. It gives a council great scope to levy these charges how it sees fit, irrespective of how they do it. I'm not the one you should be answering, nor should the state government be the one you should be justifying. So it's to your own community about how you do this.
So we'll just put last call for any questions because we're getting close to the time. And if not, look, Leighton or Mark Connor's got a question. Standardised rate notices. I think my council would like to see that too. They're always wanting changes. I'd like to see that.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, thanks, Wayne. Look, standardised rate notice. Yes, one of the recommendations of the reform was to look at some standardised content. I will, though, point out, of course, it's obvious what's on there now is mostly required by regulations anyway. And when we look at all your rate notices, they're all pretty similar. I think we could do some things improving some of the communication around what accompanies rate notices, and that's something that the Revenue and Rating Guide, the working group, we are developing a component of the new guide which is intended to provide some language and therefore material that all councils could use for some of their communication pieces around the rates notice. But we'd certainly like to perhaps look at what some standardising might actually look like as well. Bearing in mind that the rates notice is the #1 form of communication you have with your community. For most of your ratepayers or your community members, it's the one and only form of communication they have with their council all year is the rate notice. So it's actually pretty fundamental and pretty important. There's close to 3.1 million of them issued every year. So it's something, yeah, we'd like to do a bit of work, and we're starting that with the working group that the new Revenue and Rating Guide will include some material which we hope councils can then utilise for some of their communications that accompany the rate notice.
Leighton, we're right on time. So at this stage, I'd like to thank you very much for your work. And people, I'm not sure, most people realise this. I think they know that you're one of the key drivers in LGV when it comes to the rating provisions and the acts. And I know you're one of the key architects of and design behind it. But at the same time, you've also been under a lot of pressure over the last, you've been in local government, in the local government department for 6 years. I think you've had more ministers than you've had years in local government.
We've had a few, thanks, Danny. Yeah, and look, we're in the same position as you guys. You know, we don't make the decisions. We advise the elected representatives of the day, and A lot of the time they take our advice, sometimes they don't, sometimes they, and then we have to deal with that. And that's part of our responsibility and our job. So we are always keen though to ensure that your voice is heard and your concerns are conveyed through to government, and it's something we'll continue to do so, particularly around any future changes to the revenue and rating system, to make sure that we have a system that is it suits us all and works best for all Victorians. So look forward to working with you in the future.
Great, Leighton, and thanks very much. Look, I know Leighton's a regular with discussions with FinPro. Our FinPro exec have regular meetings with LGV, and he's been part of that process for quite a few years now, so we all appreciate that. And look, very much on behalf of all the members who attended today and all the ones who will see this recording in the next few months, thank you very much, Leighton. It's I really appreciate your work, and it's been a great session. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.